Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. They say, don't they, that people in the north are more friendly than people in the south. I can say that, I'm genetically a southerner. But already this morning, you've given a huge plug to my books and applauded me before I've even opened my mouth. That really is friendliness and welcome. I hope you applaud by the end of the talk as well. That will be the real test. So I think our plan is I'm going to be talking for about 45 minutes or so. There's lots of opportunity for questions and discussion, but I think we're putting that towards the back end of our time together. And I'm going to talk a bit about Christian nationalism, but my way into that will tell you a little bit about Theos, which is the organisation I work for. We're a Christian think tank. We've been going 20 years now. We were launched in November 2006. By some quirk of divine humour, that was about a month after Richard Dawkins published The God Delusion. So for the first kind of 5 years of our existence, you can imagine the kind of conversations we found ourselves in, the kind of conversations where faith has no role in contemporary public life. It is a backward-looking, irrational, and dangerous human trait, or human virus, as the new atheists put it. And whilst in a liberal society you are free to believe and do whatever you like in the privacy of your own home, that kind of behaviour and mentality does not belong in politics. I respectfully disagree with that. We respectfully disagree with that. And we spent a lot of time making the case for Christianity in public life. But at no point when we were doing that would I have imagined that 15, 20 years later we'd be faced with a situation whereby the default conversation is the role of religion in public life. It's not a question of whether religion and Christianity is in public life. It's what kind of Christianity is in public life. Something, everybody in the room will be alert to this. Something quite seismic is happening in British and indeed in Western politics over the last 5 or 10 years or so. And there are lots of things going on, not least yesterday. I'm not going to talk about that, but we might come back to it in the Q&A. But I think one of the things that's going on is the whole register, the whole tone of our public debate has changed. 20 years ago, when we were launched, it was quite technocratic. In other words, it was about getting the right fixes, turning the levers on the machine just the right amount, making sure the policies were tweaked in the right way. 20 years later, it seems that something much more substantial is at play. Questions about who we are as a society, what our fundamental values are, and perhaps you might have picked this up when you were doing your thing on AI last year or the year before, what isn't even intrinsic about human beings in this age of artificial intelligence. So there's an awful lot going on, and in one respect at least, this is an enormous opportunity for Christians to speak into public debate. It's a messy, lively and angry public debate, as we know, but it's one that I think is much more open to the kind of profound truths about who we are that come with the gospel. That leads into something of Christian nationalism, because that is about who we are as a nation. Who we are as a nation. And I'm going to talk a bit about that, and I will explain the picture that's on my opening slide towards the end. There were lots of pictures I could have chosen to illustrate Christian nationalism. In fact, you had one or two on your carousel beforehand, a person standing on top of one of the lines of Trafalgar Square, it looked like carrying a cross in one hand and a flag in the other, with smoke going out. That's the kind of Christian nationalism, dramatically put. This is very much less dramatic. But actually for me it was quite eye-opening and quite personal. I'll explain why right at the end of what I have to say. So the first thing to begin about is really the question of what even is Christian nationalism, because that's kind of important, right? If you don't know what it is, you don't know how to respond to it. And we don't know what it is. Or more precisely, we have lots of different opinions of what Christian nationalism is. We are working on this at Theos. We applied to a grant-making organisation about a year ago with the ask saying, look, we know that Christian nationalism, I'm going to leave that in kind of inverted commas for now, we know that Christian nationalism is a big thing in America and has been for 5 or so years, arguably a bit longer. We think that the landscape is changing over here in Britain and continental Europe, and we would like to do a research project on what it is, what its kind of contours are, what's driving it, how you respond to it. Because it is not simply the case that whatever happens in America comes over here. This phenomenon is shaped by the demography, the politics, the culture, the ecclesiastical landscape in each country differently. So if it is coming over here, we want to understand what it looks like, how it might be different. And the funders bought it, and they gave us a grant to do it. And then, gratifyingly or not, as the case may be, Tommy Robinson organised Unite the Kingdom March through London last September, where many, many people were carrying Christian banners and crosses, and the commentariat went bananas, because we're just not used to this kind of politics over here. And there were lots and lots of people opining on what's going on and why is it happening, often without the basis of any research because there isn't much there. Interestingly, there is another Unite the Kingdom rally next Saturday, marching through London. I will be there for research purposes. If you see someone who looks very similar to me on your screens, it is me, unless they're throwing things at the police, in which case it very much isn't me. And there was also a Unite the Kingdom carol concert in Whitehall in December last year, which I also attended, and I'll come back to at the end. Either way, because of this relatively rapid kind of intrusion of this Christian nationalism into public life, you had lots of people declaring what it was. And they didn't always declare it in exactly the same way. So the veteran Guardian columnist Polly Toynbee, no friend of Christianity, wrote, "The Christian label offers a veneer of respectability to tribal racists, unlikely to fill actual pews, an identity cloak for gut nativists who abhor anyone a bit brown." Polly Toynbee doesn't pull her punches, particularly when it comes to religious faith, and as far as she's concerned, Christian nationalism is basically just racism with a very, very thin Christian patina there. Others are perhaps less visceral, but no less critical. The National Secular Society has been the main kind of anti-religious campaigning group in the UK for 150 years or so now, and in a sense, the Unite the Kingdom rally and the Christian presence therein was grist to their mill. And they wrote a piece, "Christian Nationalism Threatens Democracy," rather predictably, secularism protects it. So if one anti-Christian thinker thinks that Christian nationalism is basically just racism, another group think it is fundamentally anti-democratic. Either way, it's not a good thing. But others have been a little bit more positive. I'm conscious that you might not be able to see this, so I'll read this out. This is a quotation from a book looking at this topic with the US focus. "Christian nationalism has influenced activists across the political and religious spectrum, black and white, left and right, for centuries. Americans have never really separated church from state, nor have they truly championed the free exercise of religion. Christian activists from Frederick Douglass to Jerry Falwell used the Bible to try and impose their values and beliefs on the nation. So what you get from that perspective on Christian nationalism is that it's a much, much broader church. It's left and right, it's black and white, very important categories when it comes to American society, politics and religion. And it is about imposing biblical values on wider society. That word impose is always kind of inserted in there, and very rarely do people use the word impose positively. But in a sense, if you're saying it can be imposed by left and right, you're kind of hinting at the fact that it might be a good thing if you agree with one of those particular political agendas. Either way, then, that reading of it, it's a bit more positive than mere racism or mere sort of nativism or anti-democratic sentiments. But it is still nonetheless an imposition of Christian views on the rest of us. Oops, is he? Went too far. And then there are some people who are altogether more positive about it. Rusty Reno edits the conservative Catholic American magazine First Things. He wrote a couple of years ago, Christian nationalism is America's best hope. An inherently self-limiting form of nationalism that does not fall prey to the utopian dreams of progressivism and curbs the sometimes unrestrained zeal of patriotism. So that's quite an interesting perspective. What he's saying there is that American culture and society is plagued by various different sort of pathological isms, and one of those is nationalism, the kind of hard ethno-nationalistic America first mentality, which is aggressively nationalistic. And at the very other end of the spectrum, he would put extreme progressivism, that he would pin very squarely on the Democratic Party, which he would accuse of tearing America's fabric apart. And his argument is that Christian nationalism can kind of thread that needle. It can bring to proper nationalistic sentiments a degree of self-limiting self-reflection, a belief in the value of the nation, but to temper it with a commitment to Christianity, which stops it from sliding into outright ethno-nationalism, the kind of effective view, which is definitely a view in the US, and the research shows that it is, that to be American you basically need to be white. So what you can see just from those four examples, and you could multiply them, there are a number of different ways of understanding this term. And at this point, you might be tempted to put your head in your hands and think, what possible chance have we got to respond to this if it can mean so many different things? Well, kind of that's the nature with language in the first instance. We have to be aware of this. These big, capacious terms are used by different people in different ways. And we're never going to be able to prevent that. And you will always find yourself in a conversation. I have found myself in a conversation when I've talked about Christian nationalism with somebody, and they've turned around and said, but that's not what I mean by Christian nationalism. It's no good simply going to the dictionary and saying, this is exactly what it means, because people use these complex terms in different ways. But we shouldn't give up all hope, because we can bring a bit of precision to what it means and how we should interpret it, which then allows us to kind of respond in a slightly more positive way. Let me begin by doing that then, by, as it were, paring away what I think it isn't. And then we'll come on to the slightly more substantive point of what it is. I don't think Christian nationalism is merely a political movement. Now, what I mean by that is sometimes what you see here is that actually this is just a form of political reaction, and we can ignore the Christian bit of it, right? This would happen anyway. The Christian bit doesn't add anything to it. We need to see this as a purely political view. Now, I can understand why people say that. I have some sympathy with that kind of view, because sometimes when you see something you don't like and it's wearing the same badge that you're wearing, your instinctive reaction is to say, yeah, but the badge that they're wearing, they don't really mean it. But nonetheless, I don't think you can quite take that avenue because they are wearing it. And there are lots of different ways to react in politics and to articulate a view in politics that don't necessitate you appropriating religious language, religious symbols, religious ideas. So you could make the argument that this is happening anyway. And in one sense, it very obviously is. But at very least, it's important to be curious about why this is coming under a Christian umbrella. So I don't think you can say it's merely political and not in any way religious or Christian. But nor, very importantly, is it simply a matter of wanting Christian values embedded in government and society. So this is a real danger with this subject. As you would have picked up, Christian nationalism is a bit of a dustbin term, right? And that means that you can throw lots of things in it, and a lot of the things you throw in the dustbin are stuff you don't really like. So if you don't like the idea of saying, you know, we owe an enormous amount to our as a country to our Christian heritage and our Christian background, you can kind of say, well, anybody who says this has fundamentally been a Christian country, well, you're a bit Christian nationalistic, aren't you? Well, I don't think that's true at all. If it is, I would be a fully paid up Christian nationalist. You don't have to do much history to realise that a huge amount of who we are as a nation, what our values and commitments are down to our Christianity, and wanting to see those reflected in government and in society doesn't make you a Christian nationalist so much as a Christian. As I'm sure all of you will be very familiar with Latin, I'm going to try the pronunciation. Any native Latin speakers in the room are going to have to forgive me. Nisi Dominus aedificarit domum et vanum laboravunt qui aedificant eam, which of course means, except the Lord buildeth the house, they labour in vain that build it. It comes from Psalter, Psalm 127, and it is inscribed in the floor of the lobby of the House of Commons. How much more aggressive Christian nationalist gesture could you possibly have than literally to build the scriptures into the fabric of our governing edifice? That was pretty uncontroversial when it was built there in the Victorian period. And it is nonetheless a fact today that there are many, many people who would like to see Christian values embedded in their government, in their society. That is not the same as Christian nationalism, I contend. As I was hinting at, just as Christian nationalism is not simply of wanting the values to be embedded in government and society, nor is it simply a matter of claiming that my nation has been overwhelmingly Christian throughout its history. This is a book published by, written by Bijan Omrani, came out last year. God is an Englishman, Christianity and the Creation of England. There have been a number of these books published over the last 10 years or so. Philosopher Larry Siedentop wrote one called Inventing the Individual. Probably most famously, the historian Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion, which is about how Christianity shaped the entirety of the Western mind and the Western world. Historically speaking, this isn't very controversial. It most emphatically does not make you a Christian nationalist. As a historian, you want to recognise that it hasn't all been Christianity by any means, and Christianity has not always been used on the side of the political angels. That is very, very important to recognise. But to think that my nation has been formed by Christianity does not make you a Christian nationalist. And nor, perhaps even more confusingly, is it just about being a Christian and a nationalist. Now, this one might seem a bit counterintuitive. I was at a round table in Westminster earlier on, it was last year, and sitting opposite an MP who said to me, well, I'm a Christian and I'm a nationalist, so I guess that makes me a Christian nationalist. I don't think that's the case at all. And this young woman is a prime example of this. This is Katie Forbes, Deputy Leader of the SNP. She is a very committed evangelical Christian, and she is very prominent in a nationalist party. She ticks both those boxes, yet nobody, to the best of my knowledge, has ever accused Katie Forbes of being a Christian nationalist. This leads on to the slightly more constructive part of what I'm going to say, but it's more than the sum of its parts. It's more than simply being a Christian and believing in the nation. And lastly, when it comes to the what isn't Christian nationalism list, and most confusingly perhaps, it doesn't even necessarily demand a focus on the nation. This is one of the ways in which Europe is different from America here. Christian nationalism in America is most of the time about the nation. It's about America's manifest destiny. It's about the perception that some people have that America has some unique role within salvation history. There are occasional signs of that in European countries, but actually that isn't so prominent. And in particular, the further east you go in Europe, there is a sense of actually Christian nationalism is really about defending the culture of the continent. That's Viktor Orban, recently voted out of power Prime Minister in Hungary, having been there for 16 years, who was probably the most prominent Christian nationalist leader in the world, I would guess, over that period of time, and had done an awful lot to promote the cause of Christian nationalism. But self-consciously, this is a particular case in Hungary because of where Hungary is, the idea is what we're doing here is defending the Christian culture of Europe. Because Hungary has been on the border of that, first with the Mongol Empire in the 13th century and then with the Ottoman Empire in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. That kind of Christian nationalism isn't so much defending my nation. I want to defend my nation, I want to respect and honour Hungary, but what we're actually doing here is standing at the gates of Europe and defending the Christian nature of Europe. So Christian nationalism, properly speaking, doesn't even necessarily demand that you're obsessed with your own nation. So, I'm sure it's getting clearer for you by the minute, really, isn't it? What Christian nationalism is. We know it's a whole load of things that it isn't. Well, listen, mercifully, I think there is a relatively simple way to pinpoint what it actually is that doesn't involve you going through lists of details of what it isn't. Let me look at it this way. Very obviously, there are two different entities at play here, my nation and Christianity. And properly speaking, it's about your idea of how those two relate to one another. And we all have a view on this, and some views will be positive, some views will be negative, some views will be mixed or confused. That is what I think you could fairly call a secularist view, right? We live in a nation. It's governed by a state, run by the government. That's how it should work. If it's a free, liberal, plural, tolerant nation, it's quite acceptable for there to be Christianity here. We're not seeking to eradicate Christianity. Brackets, most secularists are, in my experience, but they certainly won't say that in public, and many are perfectly happy for there to be Christianity, but it can't affect the nation. It's got to be kept separate, a separation of church and state in the historic formula. And in extreme forms, a separation of belief and state. When we started at Theos, just before we started at Theos, Tony Blair gave an interview to Michael Parkinson. This is about 2005. Blair, interestingly, is probably the most religiously obsessed Prime Minister we've had since Gladstone. And famously, he didn't do God, although that's often mistaken. What actually happened there was that when he was leader of the opposition in 1994, 1995, he gave an interview to the Sunday Telegraph at Easter time, and Alistair Campbell, you can read this in Alistair Campbell's diaries, Alistair Campbell said, Tony, this is a bad idea, but Blair was just coming to power then, and he was obviously people noticed he was a committed believer, but he made the point explicitly clear to the Sunday Telegraph that you can vote Labour and vote Tory and other parties and be Christian. And the Telegraph reported that basically Blair said you have to vote Labour in order to be Christian. Well, Christians would naturally vote Labour. And it was a disaster, and Campbell's diaries record how he had a conversation with Blair that evening, and Blair admitted, yeah, you were right, shouldn't have done it. And the shutters came down, and he never talked about Christianity again. But he did very briefly in this interview with Michael Parkinson, which was a couple of years after the Iraq War, and he just had a very slight comment about, I will be judged by the electorate by my decision to go to war with Iraq, in Iraq, and I will also be, and if you're a religious person, you'll also be judged by God. And Parkinson leapt on that, and there was this furore about, Blair was saying that, God will excuse him for Iraq, so on and so forth. Now, the interesting point about that is that, why I'm making this here, is that in your extreme form, it's not just secularist views, not just my nation and Christianity are kept apart. My nation and Christian belief is kept apart. So not many secularists say that out loud, but often that's the kind of implicit thing. A more nuanced view, and one that I would personally hold, is what you might call a Christian democratic view. Now, that could refer to the tradition of Christian democracy that has been a very big thing in post-war European politics, but it, broadly speaking, refers to the kind of politics that we have enjoyed in this country for a very long period of time, and exists in, well, I was going to say all three main parties, but that phrase doesn't really mean anything these days, does it? Let's say all five main parties, shall we, or seven main parties, I don't know, choose your number. And this is the view that Christianity exists and my nation exists. They are separate entities, but I want one to infect, I'll put that in inverted commas because I don't mean Christianity is a disease here, but I want Christianity to infect my nation. I want my nation to reflect Christian values. That might be institutional. It might be being pro-establishment. It might be being pro-bishops and the laws, but it needn't be. It can simply be a bit more ethical. I would like the values that I understand from the gospel, our commitment to the unique dignity, equality and freedom of human beings, to be reflected in my polity. I would like the idea, which is central to the gospel, that humans are relational beings. We only flourish in relationship with one another, and therefore we should give freedom to and encourage what's known as civil society and groups meeting and supporting one another. I would like that to be reflected in my society. I would like the fundamental Christian commitment to our basic equality to be reflected in my economic policy, which took a rein in on galloping levels of inequality. I want my Christian values to shape, to inform my nation, but I will recognise that my nation isn't the church. And nations are finally plural, as in they have lots of different people who believe lots of different things, and it would be wrong for me, however much I intently believe in my Christianity, to impose those views on the nation and to insist that those views are held. I will make the case for them. I will try and persuade as many people as possible, but I recognise that the church and the nation, Christianity as a nation, are different things. And if it doesn't go my way, I just take my medicine and move on. That's what involves living in a democracy. I think that is a healthy view here. Why I think a Christian nationalist view is different is that it elides those two. And it kind of fundamentally says my nation is Christian, not just in a kind of historic sense it's been Christian, not in the kind of ambitious sense, and I would like it to be more Christian, but it is fundamentally Christian in its DNA, as it were. And therefore, in its most extreme form, to belong to this nation, you've got to be Christian. Okay? You've got to sign up. This is a Christian nation, and therefore people within the nation who are not Christian are, by that definition, going to be a threat to the nation. Because if my nation is defined by Christianity, I can't risk there being non-Christians in the nation. because it will undermine who we are. There is a very obvious flaw in this view, though, which is, by best estimates, something like 10, 12, maybe 14% of people actually go to church. A slightly higher number of people will confess to having Christian beliefs, but when it comes to actually being a Christian, if your definition of being Christian is kind of heading off to church on a Sunday morning, clearly isn't. So what you very often find within Christian nationalist rhetoric is this subtle slide towards vague language. And Christian nationalists will speak about Christian or sometimes Judeo-Christian values or morality or culture or civilization. And they'll say that my nation is a Christian nation. This is a Christian nation. We hold to Christian values, Christian morality. And if you don't hold those Christian values, really you don't belong here. Or maybe in a slightly less extreme way, you're kind of a second-class citizen because you don't fully sign up to the Christian values that make this nation what it is. Interestingly, having read through the kind of literature and the tweets, social media of a lot of Christian nationalists, you find a real eagerness to talk about Christian values, somewhat more reluctant to talk about Christ. And I think that's very interesting, partly because of very specific reasons of Christ having some rather positive things to say about welcoming the stranger amongst you, but also because if you start talking about Christ, you're kind of pinning yourself on an ethical map, right? It's very easy to say, I'm advocating this because of my Christian values, because Christian values is one of those phrases that's got a kind of a nose of wax, right? You can just twist it in whichever way you happen to be pointing. It's a different thing saying, I advocate these views because of Christ. Because the obvious follow-up question is, give me chapter and verse on that. Or at least let's discuss what it is about the teachings of Jesus Christ, or the gospel, or the New Testament, or whatever it is, that is leading you to that position. And it draws you into a concrete conversation where you need to explain what are the, as it were, theological justifications for what you're talking about. I'm conscious that I'm going on for too long. I'll speed up slightly. So what does that mean that Christian nationalists want? Well, if you believe in a Christian nation, you want to preserve a Christian nation. And therefore, you want to preserve it from threats against the Christian nation. What is a threat against the Christian nation? Broadly speaking, there are, I think, three. Very obviously, Islam. Islam or Muslims become a threat to our Christian nation because they fundamentally believe something that is very different and antithetical, so the argument goes, to Christianity that has made us who we are. So, the demand here is to ban Sharia law, to ban Islamic arbitration councils, to prohibit the construction of new mosques, to ban minarets and a call to prayer. We recently heard the chairman of Reform, what's his name? Anyway, it demanded saying we mustn't. Dear Yusuf, thank you. Sorry, yeah, Dear Yusuf, saying we would ban, Reform would ban churches turning into mosques, restricting Islamic dress, more state policing of mosques, limiting migration from Muslim countries, and advocating stronger cultural assimilation, and at its extreme advocating remigration, which is kind of ICE, essentially. So, instance, the details don't matter so much. The point is that Islam is seen as the pathology here, it's seen as the threat to our Christian nation, and then you have various kind of levels of how do we deal with that? You deal with it by kind of controlling that threat, policing it, preventing its extension, preventing the free expression of that religious faith in public life, hence the point about prayer in Trafalgar Square that kicked up such a fuss about a month or so ago, and in extreme forms actually kicking them out. Second threat is from immigration and asylum. It's seen as from both. This debate is so often elided, and asylum and immigration are talked about in the same breath. I would argue, ethically speaking at least, they're fundamentally different things, and we should try and keep them apart from one another when we talk about them. But there is a strong sense that what we need to do to protect the Christianity of our nation, or protect our nation as a Christian nation, is to limit immigration, particularly to countries that are culturally similar, to refuse asylum claims, to make stronger border enforcement, mass deportation of unauthorised migrants, remigration again, ending multicultural policies. Now, there's a really important caveat here, which is that just because some people who advocate these views may do so from pretty dark reasons, it doesn't mean there isn't a political debate to have here. And actually, one of the reasons I think we are in the situation we are in politically at the moment is because we haven't had that debate well enough. One of the things I do at Theos is run a podcast interviewing authors about books, and I recently interviewed a guy called Alan Manning, who used to run the government's Migration Advisory Council. He's an academic, and he's written a book called Why Immigration Policy is Hard and How to Improve It. Really good book, very, very detailed, lots of information in it. And one of the points he makes in the book is that democracies work by oppositions, right? You have parties that come forward and advocate a point of view, and then you have other parties that come forward and advocate a different point of view. And that's how democracies flourish. You have alternative options for voters to kind of throw their weight behind. But over the last 20 years or so, Westminster had come to a broad consensus on immigration for different reasons. The left liked immigration because it was, generally speaking, pro-diversity, and the right liked immigration because it was, broadly speaking, pro-business. And business always lobbies for lower restrictions on immigration. So you had both main parties being positive about large levels of immigration, but not taking the British people with them. And the result being that migration has become a massive issue and is kind of dominating so much of our politics. And it's quite right that it should be an important issue, because it is an important issue. So I don't want to be suggesting by saying, oh, Christian nationalists are all anti-asylum, anti-migration. We must therefore flock to the other extreme and have an open border policy. That's emphatically not what I'm saying. There is a quite proper debate to be had here about levels of immigration, levels of asylum, just as there is a quite proper debate to be had about the levels of cultural pluralism that comes with Islam in the UK. They're important debates. The point I'm making here is that one of the demands of Christian nationalism is, as far as possible, we bring down the shutters on immigration and particularly asylum, because they are a threat to who we are as a nation. And it's interesting that that's one of the reasons why this has become such a flashpoint in this debate, because as innumerable people have pointed out, Jesus was really quite positive about welcoming the stranger. The third threat, elites. Elites are, I say this as someone who is university educated, lives in Surrey and works in Westminster, okay, so I feel the finger here pointing at me. But the point about elites is they're not in connection with us as the people, and they have a greater commitment to those bodies and institutions and organisations and values that are fundamentally international and not connected with the people. And so we want to withdraw from international institutions because they limit our sovereignty as a nation. We want to undermine those institutions that allegedly subvert that parliamentary sovereignty, the famous Daily Mail enemies of the people headline about the 3 judges on the Brexit judgment. We will attack those cultural institutions, whether the BBC, Church of England, mainstream media, civil service, universities, that are deemed to be captured by the elites. And in extreme, you replace representative democracy with direct, or sometimes plebiscitary democracy, which is basically the people get to vote on everything all the time, which I imagine is really tiring. Yeah, you probably don't want to do that all the time. Again, the details don't matter so much here as the sense of, in the desire to preserve our genetically Christian values as a nation that are reflected in our people, we need to accuse and to minimise the influence of those elites who do not share those values. And again, as with the previous 2 points, there is a serious debate to be had here. There's a very good book by a social commentator called David Goodhart called The Road to Somewhere. It's called The Road to Somewhere, in which, through research and analysis, he points out that he separates people in UK into somewheres and anywheres, and this is effectively his way of saying most people, it's about 80% of people, have a commitment to somewhere, where they live, their community, their home. But then there are much more metropolitan-minded, educated elites who have a commitment to anywhere. Basically, they're citizens of nowhere, to use the phrase. And the anywheres have been governing the somewheres for a long period of time, and it makes the somewheres very unhappy. It's a very strong argument. There is a debate to be had here. And that Christian nationalism is speaking into that debate. That's what they're alert to. Right, how do we respond to that? I've given myself all of 6 minutes to do this. Okay. I want to illustrate this just with, I want to answer this by some illustrations, because how you respond to it is a concrete thing. I'm not going to give you a list of A, B, C, D, E. I mentioned I went to the Tommy Robinson Unite the Kingdom Carol concert last December in Whitehall. This was undoubtedly the most English sign I saw amongst all of them. There were 2 protests in Whitehall that afternoon, and the authority stuck up a digital sign saying, queue in the right direction for whichever protest you want to go to. Right? Forget the St George's Cross, get in the right queue. That was Englishness on steroids. I went to the Unite the Kingdom rally, which was queue left, please. I took some advice before going there. I've never been to anything like this beforehand. I didn't go to the one in September. I was a bit anxious. You'll be shocked to hear I've never been to a far-right rally in my life. It was seriously underwhelming. Right? There was 150,000 people at the September one. There was about 1,500 people at the December one. Tommy Robinson has had a conversion experience in prison, and he does a lot of Christianity now, and and he tweets a lot about it. I knew what to expect when I went there. I didn't get what I expected. Beforehand, he had tweeted, this is about honouring our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ. No politics, no Islam, no immigration. And I thought to myself, yeah, right. Whitehall is a pretty strange place to hold a non-political carol concert, yeah? There for an hour and a half or so. There was no politics, there was no immigration. There was one mention of Islam, who happened to be from the lips of a Pakistani pastor who was on stage, who exhorted the crowd to pray for the persecuted church in Pakistan. The whole thing felt 2/3 carol concert, 1/3 revival movement. Tommy Robinson was only there for the last 5 minutes. In fact, to the extent that one woman shouted behind me when we were about 85 minutes, "Where's Tommy?" And he only came for the last 5 minutes, and the crowd loved it when he did come, but it was absolutely not a personality cult thing. There was a succession of various different ministers. There was a young guy on stage, talked about mental health and how he became a Christian, and how this is an issue for a number of young people in his generation. It was a relatively multi-ethnic event. There was a black worship group on the stage. There were a number of minority ethnic pastors. The crowd was relatively mixed ethnically, not by London standards, but certainly it wasn't all white. And it wasn't simply a kind of a patina of singing the occasional song here and there. They said Christianity is not about just going to carol concerts. It's a 7-day-a-week thing. Get thee to a church. Fine, if you haven't got a church, go to it. They drew the line at Church of England churches. I'm afraid to say, explicitly did. They said, go to a church, but go to a proper church, not a Church of England churches. This isn't, okay, I'm quoting, I'm not editorialising here. But the point they were making was that, the bishops had been on their backs about the United Kingdom rally, and, we want to go to a church that preaches the gospel. It was discombobulating, okay? I didn't want this because I knew what to expect. And I came away thinking, if you'd white labelled this event, if you hadn't known who was behind it, you'd have thought, carol concert. I have to say, a carol concert with a much more working class feel than you normally get in London, and partly revival meeting. So what do you make of that? Okay? I think that what I'm saying is that the first thing to do is to listen. I think it's so important to listen. And I watched the coverage of this event, and people were absolutely very willing to put the boot in. Now, I make it very clear here, I'm not holding a candle for Tommy Robinson. Very interesting that his Twitter feed or social media feed talks about, this is about honouring our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, and then pretty much as soon as it's after goes back to what it normally is, which is retweeting videos of people with brown skin doing horrible things. So, I'm under no illusion in what's going on here, but there were a couple of coverages of this and this phenomenon, which are kind of saying that people are asking for something, and if we simply respond to it by saying, ugh, you are a gut nativist, to quote Polly Toynbee, you're basically a racist, we are at very least missing an opportunity there. We are doing a project at Theos about why young people are turning to faith today. The numbers have been a bit inflated recently, but they are, and we've interviewed a number of them. And my colleague Esme was doing the research, and she said one of the people she researched, a young man who basically come into church, and in his own words, I had a lot of hate in my heart. I was coming to church because I wanted to assert my Britishness as opposed to being an Islamic country. And he said my heart was melted when I was there. I think that's a pastoral response. You listen, you welcome, you talk, you engage. You may need to push back at some point, right? Let's not be naive about this. But I think our first response to this has to be to hear what's going on, because there's going to be a lot of anger and there's going to be some hatred there, but there's also going to be some pain and there's also going to be some need. Second response, this is a book I wrote about 10 years ago now on the political Samaritan, about the way that the parable of the the Good Samaritan has been used in British politics in the last 50 years or so. It's been used by everybody, from Margaret Thatcher all the way to Jeremy Corbyn. It won't surprise you to learn that it hasn't always been used in the same way. The Samaritan is wheeled out lots of times, and particularly recently with regard to this issue, because the Samaritan is about reaching out across ethnic and cultural and religious divides and welcoming somebody and really making an effort. I don't know if you remember the spat there was last year between Rory Stewart, former Conservative MP, now podcaster, and J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States. And J.D. Vance had talked about the Ordo Amoris, which is the order of love, which basically, as he said, I hold to, he thinks it's a Christian view, which is that you look after your family first, then your wider family, then your extended community, then your nation, and only then international responsibilities. And Rory Stewart criticised that, and then so did Pope Francis, and Pope Francis criticised it by referring to the parable of the Good Samaritan. This is what I mean when I talked about earlier about this is kind of the register in which our politics occurs these days, okay? 20 years ago, back in the New Atheist days, don't quote scripture in public life. Now, we quote scripture and we need to decide what it means. There is a really important, and it's an incredibly difficult debate around what are our moral national responsibilities. And I don't hold to the Order Amoris as J.D. Vance explained it, because what he basically said is first you do this, family, then you do community, then you do locality, then you do nation. But that means that you never get to the end, right? Because all families have got problems, all communities have got problems, and eventually your charity runs out about there and you never get to the end. So I don't agree with that. But the flip side is simply translating the parable of the Good Samaritan into government policy doesn't work. Partly for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The nation isn't the church, right? Attempts to govern the nation as the church, which is kind of what we did in the Commonwealth period of the 1650s, don't turn out brilliantly. And we don't view the kind of person that lets their own child starve so they can feed 10 children on the other side of the world as a moral hero. We look upon them as a bad parent. We do have local responsibilities, and we do need to recognise them. But I think what the parable of the Good Samaritan says is that you do have those local responsibilities, but when you are made aware of the desperate need of others, sometimes those more distant but desperate responsibilities can trump the immediate ones you have. This is a huge debate, but I guess the point I'm making about here is that we need to be both realistic about the fact that the nation is not the church, but also not simply pragmatic. And we do want to intrude our ethical values onto that debate. So do politics, do it sensibly, but also do it morally. This is my last example. This is a weird one. I live in Epsom, in Surrey. Some of you may have picked up that Epsom hit the news recently. It's on a Saturday morning. It's BBC headline: "Woman raped by several men outside church." That's our Methodist church in the town that I walk past every day. And the news report went that there was a gang rape of a woman in the early hours of the church on the Saturday morning after she'd come out of the club around the corner. Horrible, horrible. The community is reeling. People are very upset. Not surprisingly, town is left in shock by appalling rape outside church. A couple of days later, I'm coming home on the train. My daughter, who was at home from university, called me and said, "Dad, what's going on in Epsom Town Centre?" "I don't know." She said, "What?" Zach, my boyfriend, and I drove past it. There were loads and loads of police vans there. I come out of the train station. I walk into a crowd of about 300 people, 8 or 9 police vans, all full of police in riot gear. Police issue disorder warning after rape protest. So I've never been anywhere that was about to kick off into a riot, and it was knife edge stuff. It was absolutely fascinating. There's a guy of research talking. This riot was fascinating. I mean, there was so much going on there. I don't want to talk too much about negative. I'm happy to come back to it. Half the street there were people facing up against the police, and there was this palpable sense that if the police had reacted just very slightly badly, just one kind of push, the whole thing would have kicked off. And I absolute respect for the police, because you have people throwing eggs at them and the occasional traffic cone. They just stood there and they basically bored people into submission. So eventually they left. But at the same time, when the people were kind of squaring off, at the other side there was almost a party atmosphere. There's someone who brought a speaker, there were people with dogs, there were families there. What's going on here? And it really underlined to me, I tell you what one of the things that's going on here, just low-level thuggery. Okay? We have been analysing and looking at the details of Christian nationalism, and there are things going on here, and there are policy responses, and there are theological responses. But what I saw there was people who wanted things to kick off with the police a bit, and were just provoking them for a ruck. Because then they could say the police attacked us. So there's just a low-level thuggery element in all this, and we can't be blind to that. But here's the tragedy of this story. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. So the people had kicked off because the police had not released any information about the alleged rapists, in plural. But the reason the police had not released any information was not, as the crowd thought, and as people were saying online, we know what's going on here. These are asylum seekers, migrants, people from different cultures who have a low view of women, who found a white woman, raped her, and the police don't want to inflame community tension, so they're hiding the identity of the rapist because they know that, don't care about the safety of white women in Epsom, and this is unacceptable. And of course, because of Rotherham, they can point to that and say, there's precedent there. And social media exacerbates this and sends it round. And actually what happened was that, I mean, this is all very opaque. She said that it was a head injury, and she withdrew the accusation. Either way, the police said there was no rape there. So actually, there wasn't a riot in Epsom. The police, as I said, managed to bore people into submission. But there could have been, and in fact, they came back. I didn't have a photo. They came back a few days later and started throwing bricks. Well, they started squaring off against a Premier Inn that's in the town centre that they said was housing asylum seekers. It doesn't. And then they went up the road to an alleged Home Office accommodation that was housing asylum seekers, and it didn't, and they kicked off there. So there's a low level of thuggery there. But what struck me about all this is that fear is the fuel of this, right? Because it's not unreasonable to be afraid after there has been a horrific attack like that. That's not unreasonable. But if our public culture is dominated by fear, you invariably end up seeing the other as a threat, because everybody is a potential threat like that. And you circulate into a kind of spiral of resentment. And I guess that is the final kind of gospel message here. Repeatedly, you get in the Gospels, be not afraid, because fear is a pretty natural human reaction. But be not afraid. And if you can withdraw the poison of that fear from so much of our public life, you can make some of these situations more constructive, more hospitable, and more positive. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Awesome. Couldn't have had a better introduction to what goes through our minds, what we think, what we mean when we hear those words, Christian nationalism. There will be more opportunity to explore with Nick a little bit later, but now we're going to take a comfort break.
Hello everybody. Thank you for having me. It's kind of nice to be described as not the Westminster bubble end of it, because people often forget that we do spend a bit of time up in our constituencies as well. Why am I here? I think one of the reasons why I'm here is that some people will have spoken to me or heard from me before about my faith. I was a 10-year-old who went and knocked on Reverend Hughes at St Kentigern's Church's door when I was in primary school, and having not been christened by my parents, asked if I could be baptised. And I spent a number of years as a young man active in the youth sections within the church in Keswick, and then up into like my early teens in wider sense in Cumbria. And funnily enough, it was something happened to me, and it was in this room that it happened to me. And you know, it's where our faith gets challenged, if I'm honest. I realised that when I became a teenager that a lot of the events that were being put on for young people were very obsessed with the issue of sex before marriage. And I'd gone to multiple events where this had been raised, and you know, they would bring us in, there was a band playing, but all of the talk, all of the lessons within the session was around that issue. And I'd gone through a church where we met lots of people who'd worked internationally in Africa, working with the poor, working with the sick, and I believed that the church had more to give than to be lecturing me as a teenager about sex before marriage, an issue which it really didn't need to worry about, because it was a few years before that became a possibility anyway. And so I found myself in a position here where I left here one evening, and it was one of the last times I ever did anything as a young man with the church, because I felt that actually what the church, my Christianity, was about something bigger. I'd grown up in a political household, that may have been part of it. on the living room wall in my house was a framed print commemorating the Great Strike with the words which I think are from Matthew. I'm going to get this wrong, so please anyone correct me, but I think it's along the lines of, as ye have done unto the least of my brethren, ye have done to me. For me, for what I was becoming politically as I grew up, for the lessons that I'd taken from the Christian upbringing I'd had, those were the important messages. And so it's very hard for me to distinguish where my politics and where my Christianity start and finish. They've always been a part of the same thing. Some people might find that strange. Some of you may even have noticed parts of my voting record and questioned whether I'm really a Christian or not. I guess you could put me in the liberal tradition. I went to a evangelical church, but I guess my wider look of the world had led me into a very liberal position. And I went at university, I tried to re-engage with Christianity at university, and again, I found a Christian union. I was doing one of three things. If I wasn't studying, which was quite rare, I was going to music events, I was going to anti-war events, or I was trying to engage with the Christian Union. And in the Christian Union events, I was meeting people that were listening to Christian music, some of them explicitly stating that they wouldn't listen to what they described as secular music. And I found that they weren't engaging with the anti-war movement at the time when the Iraq war was starting. And again, I found that very, very strange. So, apologies if any of you find that I don't fit into a neat, tidy box in terms of where my Christian is. All I can tell you is that my belief that Christ is Saviour, and the influence that's had on me, and the questions that's had me asking about what is right and wrong throughout my life, is very, very real. And I hope it will be for a very, very long time. Part of the question I've been asked today is about what's in my inbox. As an MP, we are the complaint service of last resort. But we've ended up in a situation where I have people who want to ask me about a policy. I have people who will have a problem with an organisation that they want the MP to help try and fix. But we also get a lot of anger, a lot of screaming emails, very often linked to events that they're seeing in the news. And it's quite simple sometimes to link an angry, often fearful email to a Daily Mail article or what's being broadcast on GB News that day. And so, part of my role is to communicate with these people and try and convince them often that issues are more complicated, more nuanced, and that actually just because some GB News journalist has told them that as a Labour MP, my view is as simple as X, very often they're wrong. So it's quite difficult sometimes to pick out faith from these emails though. And I asked my researcher as part of the preparation to this to go and look for evidence of Christian nationalism within my inbox, and she couldn't see it. But as someone who's spent my time around the church and around the issue of far-right politics, which I've been following for many years, there are themes that I regularly pick out. And it's odd that my researcher did that and overlooked the simple fact that quite recently I received a death threat. Might be an extreme way of describing it, but the phrase "death to Marcus Campbell-Savers" was used, but there was a question mark at the end of it, so perhaps they weren't quite decided. But it was linked to a post. It was linked to a post about abortion. It was linked to a post about abortion, and a vote that I'd participated in, where there's been a move within Parliament to decriminalise the act of abortion, where it's carried out by often very vulnerable women who are doing it after the legal period in which they can do it. It's a very difficult, it's a very emotive issue, and for me, for me to see somebody who I know in the community, I know is a vulnerable person, I've seen them slowly become more Christian in terms of their social media output, to express that view against what I've done is a real wake-up call, and it's one of those moments where you really do take, you know, who you think you are as a Christian and who you are as a politician and what you're trying to achieve, and you do ask yourself deep questions. You know, as I had to do over issues like the assisted dying bill. But I can see this constant link between the narratives that people are being fed on social media and the anger which is being expressed at me and my colleagues on a daily basis. I get it easier than many. The women who I'm in Parliament with get it sometimes on a daily basis. Really angry stuff, really scary stuff, where the police are constantly in contact with their offices. I've got MPs whose staff don't even tell them what's being said about them on social media because of how violent and depressing it is. But my constituents on the whole, if I'm honest, I'm a very lucky one, with the exception of a handful of very, very vocal critics. I get it quite easy. That was made slightly easier by my rebellion on the farming issue, where some people moved from a position of hating me to going, well, he's all right sometimes. And generally the tone of the emails that I've received dropped from, you know, pretty bad to, you know, pretty much okay, to the extent that my staff were in tears when they read some of the emails that came in after my rebellion, as some of the people that attacked us for months and months and had zapped the energy out of them as they had to read these constant emails, were sending emails saying, thank you very much, we never thought that you as an MP would do something like that for us. But again, you know, you just give them a little bit of time, the emails start to come back in, and it's directly linked to the things that they're getting on social media. And what we're talking about is conspiracy theories. We're talking about great replacement theory, the people who believe that the elites, of which I am a member, effectively want to replace all the white Christians within this country with brown Muslims. They believe that exercise is being financed by George Soros and other elites, often people of Jewish heritage. We have people contacting us claiming that the government are putting chemicals in the air for various reasons, of which I'm never cease to be amazed. But we can see the individuals who are being most influenced by this. And I have to say that if I was to put myself in their position and imagine where I would be expressing the things that they are expressing, it would be a state of terror that I would be in. And it worries me. I've met teenagers who are expressing violent conspiracy theories. I've met middle-aged women who are expressing these. I have a woman who sends me, she originally contacted me about the assisted dying bill. She wanted to express her views that she felt that I should vote against it. We had a lovely conversation on the subject. What followed was an email virtually every other day. And it fluctuates between two issues. It's either about white people being replaced, about Muslims, grooming gangs, or it's scripture that gets sent to me. And I was reading one of the emails I was sent, and one day noticed that there was words used in there that I didn't recognise. Now I know there's lots of different versions of the Bible. I'm familiar with the King James, I'm familiar with the NRSV version. I wasn't familiar with this particular version, so what I did was I did a check and found out that this individual, who isn't just emailing it to me, has got a long mailing list of people that they know, is sending out fake scripture, which just so happens to contain words and language which is radicalizing if you are trying to stop Muslims. You know, this is an example of somebody in my inbox, and I fear for this person. They are a vulnerable person. It was very clean. It was very clear when I first met and spoke with that individual that they're a vulnerable person. So it terrifies me where this information is coming from, who's generating it, and how far it reaches. Now, I am like liberal in the truest terms, you know, in terms of where I believe people of faith, you know, where their political views should be. I think we need to be very clear that there's a distinction to be made here when we're talking about Christian nationalism. There are some people who, through their faith and through their efforts to be good Christians, may find themselves holding views which could be defined as Christian nationalist. But there are others who are using Christianity. Their worldview is being helped by them selling it as being Christian. They're weaponizing our religion for their own purposes. And I think when we're defining, we need to recognize that from my perspective, at least, that's the big problem. That's the big problem for me. And I think, the J.D. Vance versus Rory Stewart debate is a debate to be had, about, it's about where those liberal values, which Rory Stewart's probably more similar to me in that regard, meets people who are maybe coming at it from a scripture position, and there's a debate to be had. I don't think that's what necessarily Tommy Robinson and others on that side of things are doing. They are people who realise that by selling Christian values, as part of their cause, it gives it a veneer of respectability. And I find that deeply scary. I think there's an opportunity there, though, for Christians, and I think to hear that you're going to the rallies it's an interesting thing to do. It's something I've done myself. And back, it's over 10 years ago now, isn't it? When Tommy Robinson was still in the group, the English Defence League, there was a march down Whitehall. It was following the death of Lee Rigby. And I knew it was coming, and I wanted to see who'd be there. We could see on social media that this was being used to mass mobilise young working class men into rallies that were being fronted by people who we knew had a far-right background. And I wanted to see who was there. So there might be photographs out there, folks, and if it ever turns up, you can all defend me as to the reasons why. But there in the crowd is me, looking at who's there, looking how bored they were, because that's the thing that's very striking when you go on these things, is how many of the people think they're going to turn up to some great rally and then find themselves, being kettled around by the police for a few hours, not really doing very much. I think the only benefit of being on an English Defence League rally is that you're allowed to bring beer, something which the anti-war movement wasn't so keen on, I remember. So, I'm a big fan of this idea that we must try and meet people where they are, and we must try and engage with them. These people who are being led down this path, I think, are vulnerable, and they're looking for contact. And at the moment, one of the great ways for them to feel a part of something is to go down these social media rabbit holes. And when they see that somebody locally is advertising that there's going to be a rally where they can complain and be angry about the thing that they're angry about, it's a great place for them to be. And I think when they go out and they have an alternative, and whether that's organised by the church or other community groups, and we give them an alternative view of the world, that's where we want to be. I was saying before about how I think part of the challenge here is that the church used to be it was a building with people in it who communicated and mixed, and now it's a much wider thing. Okay? One of my favourite people in history is William Tyndale. He took the Latin Bible. I'm not going to try and quote any Latin. He took the Latin Bible and he put it into English. And he democratized the word of God, and he made it accessible in a way that, challenged the elites of the time. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Actually, we've gone even further than that now. Somebody in this room may have a prejudice that they hold, and it might be that the Christianity that they hear in this building doesn't feed that prejudice. But you spend half an hour on the internet, you'll probably find somebody who'll tell you that their version of Christianity agrees with you in the thing that you're angry about. Something will tell you that actually Jesus believed with you too. And I think that makes the role of this building and the people in it, and their ability to put their arms around each other and to talk and to diffuse and to show the real path is way, way more important now, I think, than it ever was. Otherwise, we just lose our people. We lose them down these rabbit holes. You know, yesterday was a sad day for me. My political party have lost its base. The people who it was always assumed would vote Labour in communities where they never believed that people on the right of politics were ever really going to be their friend have left us in huge numbers. And you know, I know part of that is down to social media. I know part of that is populism and people providing easy solutions. But I also know it's a failure on my behalf and a failure on my party's behalf and a failure on the behalf of everybody who believes in a more progressive future, because we haven't met those people where they are and helped them go with us. You know, that version of the world where some people view themselves as part of an international community and those who view themselves as the occupants of a place. It's a well-used definition within political campaigning now to recognise that there are some people who are settlers, and you've got to recognise that they're settlers and they are linked to a place. The challenge we have is that, you know, look, I'm the son of an Icelandic woman. You know, my dad travelled around the world when he was a young man and started a business by importing from overseas. You know, there were multiple languages spoken in my home as a child. I viewed myself as British and European. You know, a lot of the people I grew up with view themselves as Cumbrian and English. Simple as that. And so, you know, there's something that we've done wrong. This morning I opened up social media and there's a girl in Keswick, and she's not a Labour activist or anything, but she's written this post about how stupid these people are for how they voted yesterday. These people who voted Reform, aren't they stupid? And I simply don't believe that we can treat and talk to people in that way. The reality is that right now in this country there are people who are struggling. And when you struggle, it's quite common not to see someone on the other side of the world as the people that you want to help. And what we've learned is that many of the people who are settlers, many of the people who voted Reform, they view the world in a zero-sum game way. If you tax them, if you don't spend that money on them, their family, or their community, they resent it. If they don't see the benefit of it, to hear a liberal internationalist like me come along and say, yes, folks, but look, here's how it works. If we spend this on overseas aid at the other side of the world, you know, that probably will help reduce immigration from that region, and then that's good for you indirectly from the other side of the world. And the truth is, those people simply don't believe us on that anymore. And so my whole political view has changed. You know, I'm still left-wing, I'm still progressive. I just don't believe that we've taken people with us. I don't believe that we can move forward unless we meet them where they are. And that means, you know, that means redefining the debate on issues like immigration. You know, the government have to do something about immigration. You know, there's economists in the government that will tell you the reasons why we have to do something about immigration. But we have to be very clear, you know, do we want people coming on small boats, risking their lives, mainly men of working age, when we know that many of them are simply economic migrants, in a system which is costing huge amounts of money, where the people from them get targeted often at the same communities, and those communities are up in arms about it? Or do we do what we should have done years ago and go to the source of the international conflicts, provide safe routes from those regions, and be proud of the fact that we have an asylum system that helps the people who genuinely need it. But I believe you can do that and simultaneously reject the idea that people coming on our shores is the way that we want that system to work. And I think there's a very, it's a funny one. Shabana Mahmood, our Home Secretary, has presented what people are quite shocked at in terms of how hard an immigration system it is. But at the heart of it is a promise about safe routes. And I never believed that a Labour government in the context of a rising right-wing populism would ever talk about safe routes. But it's what we should have done all along. And if we'd done it, we could justify stronger borders because we know we were targeting help at those that need it. I think if the people in this room of faith capture those people who are living in fear, and they are, folks. My inbox tells me that they're scared. They're living in a very scary world. And it's a world that's being, a worldview which is being fed massively by lies. But when the people in this room engage with them, you can stop them turning to the flags. So, look, thanks very much, folks. I see our challenges the same, and I hope we can all meet that challenge. Thank you.
Marcus, thank you very much for bringing that perspective to our conversation this morning. And what I'd like us to do now is to spend probably up to 15 minutes on our tables, just having a buzz about what we've heard and trying to crystallise what questions we have as a result of that. And then we're going to go into a conversation, facilitated conversation, between Nick and Marcus, in which we'll try to answer some of your questions. Now, obviously, everybody in the room will have a question. Some of us will have more than one. We won't be able to answer them all. If you could crystallise one on your table, that would be helpful. Otherwise, just jot things down. We'll come round and collect them up, and then we'll pick out some to start our conversation, and we'll take it from there. So, go. Over to you, Lois.
Well, we've got one hand in the air already at the back there, so should we start with Michael? So can someone get a microphone to Michael?
TV, newspapers and social media work to make people scared. We need to give people hope. How do we structure the church to do it?
Oh wow, restructuring the church. Who wants to? I think that's more of a Nick starting point, maybe.
That question is so far above my pay grade. I can't even begin. There's the first question of what we're talking about the church here. If we're talking about the church altogether as opposed to any particular denomination, I think the greatest strength of the church is that it has many different layers to it. We were just chatting in the break. I think there is an enormous strength, and you see this particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, of its international dimension. The way in which Pope Leo is seen as kind of like the official global opposition to Donald Trump at the moment is an example of that. And I think that's very powerful because it offers a connectivity around the globe that brings the visceral needs of parts of the world right into the kind of present consciousness of richer parts of the world. And it also means that there is the danger, if you're a national church, is that you become somehow beholden to the nation. And I think internationalism is a great antidote to that. But right at the other end of the scale, I think there is an astonishing strength to the rootedness of churches within communities. We've done various research projects at Theos over the years, and one of which we did about 15 years ago for the Church Urban Fund, looking at how different churches help their communities to be resilient in difficult times. I remember interviewing a woman who ran the kind of the social enterprise for a church down in Farnborough in Surrey. And she said when she first got there, the people in the community were pretty cold and indifferent to her. And it took years for them to warm up. And when she got to know them better, she said to them, I mean, I was here to help. Why were the barriers there, first of all? And they said, because we know people come here to help. They come here for help for 3 years until the funding runs out, and then they leave. She'd been there for 21 years. The church had been there for over 100 years, and many other churches have been there for so much longer. That local embeddedness, that immediate pastoral embeddedness is enormously strong and really a calling card for the church. Ironically, I'm a bit more indifferent about the middle level, about the national structure. I know it's impossible to have an international structure and a local structure without intermediating structures, and I know they exist. And I also know I've come to meet a number of bishops in my time, and I've been very impressed with them. I mean, it's a de rigueur to give bishops a kicking, and those that I've met, I've been quite impressed with. So I don't have an exact answer, but I would say that the areas that are strongest in terms of the Christian witness and presence is that international level, the fact that we can bring, make me sound like a song now, bring the world as one through that international connection, but also that immediate local structure, which, you know, is absolutely vital to the credibility of the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to add my own little comment before. I think that business, it is possible for us to build meaningful relationships with people because we're here and we're staying here largely, and we also have a rural presence that lots of other organisations just don't have. I mean, Cockermouth counts as rural because all the services have left Cockermouth, so Cockermouth as well. We are a presence that is staying, and you said something or other had taken years. Well, it does take a long time to build trust, doesn't it? So I suppose, Marcus, from your point of view, how you said communication. It's all about communication. How could the churches behaving differently help, from your point of view, with that communication?
There's a question about how the church is organised.
Yeah.
And I would say the first step is ask yourself the question: is your community actually is your church actually embedded in your community? If you feel that your congregation broadly reflects the people living there, if your congregation is full of people who are actively engaging with the local food bank, the local credit union, the local housing trust, are actively engaging in the local schools and doing all those things, then just keep doing what you're doing. And actually, it's other sections of society where many of the institutions of the past have vanished that should be copying the church. So there's a lot that church should be proud of. But I think if you look around Cumbria, you'll see different communities where some churches are doing more than others. And I think I think there's a lot of churches represented in this room today, and I think when you all get together and you all see what each other's doing, that's a really good place to start.
Yeah. Great. Does that answer your question, Michael? Have we got another question? Yep. Martin?
We'd like to hear your comments, please, on the appropriation of Christian symbols and their use to batter Islam. I'm thinking of UKIP and UK Turning Point as two organisations who seem to do this. As the Pope has said, it's possible for Christians and Muslims to be friends.
Are you happy to start with that one, Marcus?
Yeah,
Could I ask you to hold your microphone just a little bit?
I wouldn't be an expert on this, but I think we're all we've all been quite disturbed by that. It's that image of the Crusader, isn't it, that gets used an awful lot. Not the easiest part of the history of the church to explain. Yep. And the fact that there are some in our society that want to wear that as a badge of pride is quite worrying. I'm not sure I can say much more than that.
Nick, is it something you've done work on?
So a couple of thoughts. I mean, the first thing is state what I hope is to bleeding obvious, which is I imagine most people, everyone here, is pretty revolted by the idea of taking something which is symbols of something which is inherently about life and about communion and love and turning it into something which is about exclusion. You can disagree with Islam. You can criticise Islam. There is an issue with that. You need to be able to criticise Islam. But hating it, or hating Muslims, and doing so under the guise of Christianity is not acceptable, period. But one thing I would also say, and this is picking up the flags thing, I wrote a piece last September, just as the time when flags were going up all over the country, and people were saying, this is awful. I don't think it is. Actually, I want to see flags places. It's really important to recognise flags in and of themselves don't mean anything, right? Flags absorb the meaning from the people who are doing things with them. So if you flutter a St George's flag from your car during a World Cup, that has a certain meaning of what you're saying by that flag. If you wrap yourself in a St George's flag while shooing in an asylum centre, the flag absorbs the meaning of what you're doing. I'd like to see flags up in places where we are doing humanising, loving, welcoming, supportive things. You know, things like flags in schools, or flags in courthouses, or flags in asylum seekers. I want the flag to become a symbol of positive, humanising, welcoming, supportive activities. Because if it doesn't, nature abhors, or society abhors, a symbolic vacuum, and if people doing good things don't use the flag, people doing bad things will use it, and the flag will get dragged down. So I actually want to see more flags in the right places.
Yeah. I agree, but I think we want a society where the flag doesn't frighten people. That's what we want.
And the transition is difficult, because at the moment, tragically, it does.
Yeah, it does. Yes, a female voice, lovely.
Thank you. Do you feel that what is happening in this country is actually a reaction to the general instability in the world?
Nick's turn to go first.
So, yes, would be the short answer. It really is. I mean, in a sense, very obviously what's happening in this country is mirrored by what is happening in most of, much of Western Europe, certainly in the US. We were chatting again during the break about how, whatever one thinks of Keir Starmer and Labour government, governing is really, really hard at the moment. One thing, I'm not particularly holding a candle for Keir Starmer, but I think he's handled Donald Trump pretty well, and Donald Trump is an absolute curveball in these situations. So it is, but actually I think it's even bigger than we are suffering from political instability at the moment. In fact, I think it's so big that nobody alive has experienced anything like this. For the last 200 years or so, 250 years or so, the West has been the ascendant. Right? Historians will tell you, if you go back 500 years or so, you would not have put money on this relatively small landmass right at the western edge of Eurasia becoming the global superpower. But it did, for various reasons. That has changed in the 21st century. Economically, politically, demographically, the gravity has shifted completely to the east, to Southeast Asia. And we're not used to that. We have called the shots in the West for 200 years or so, and we are now in a position whereby we're not a hegemonic power. And that creates a lot of insecurity and a lot of fear, not least when you do have an authoritarian state like China as the alternative. So I'm afraid to say I think this uncertainty is here to stay for a long time.
Yeah, when you were speaking earlier, I think one thing we could say is that we're all fearful. So, that's the way we can come alongside other people in a way. We're all terrified of what might happen in terms of World War III and so on, aren't we? So there's a fear that we all share, something in our common DNA.
There is, but just very quickly, I think fear in that regard is a little bit like recession. So the thing about the more a government talks about a recession, uses the word recession when it's doing interviews about economic prospect, the more a recession is likely, I mean, you literally talk yourself into it. I think we're in danger of talking ourselves into fear. Let's not forget, we live in one of the safest places in the world in history. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't reasons for fear, but I just get concerned about the fact that we talk about it so often, we become convinced that there is an absolute reason for it, and then we find ourselves there is an absolute reason for it. I think we need to learn to talk about these threats without talking ourselves into them.
Marcus.
I mean, again, you know, the view from my inbox, you know, the cost of living crisis, which is you know, from Ukraine to what's happening in the Middle East right now, the two things are absolutely entwined. And we have this situation where, you know, the government will point at one economic indicator, as they do, and say, look, folks, things are getting better. But everyone I speak to, everybody who engages with us, just talks about the fact that they feel poorer and poorer and poorer. Wages have not increased sufficiently for a long time, but the taxes have gone up, and the costs of their groceries have gone up. That has pushed that, you know, I mentioned before that zero-sum game view that people have of the world. When people feel that they're being made poorer, it drives that resentment of those where they see money being spent. And there's often arguments I'll get into where I'm trying to say, look, you might see money being spent on those people, but it's a small amount of money in the scheme of things. Actually, if you compare it to the amount of money that the government are putting into the NHS as a whole, you know, which is for your benefit, it's a drop in the ocean. But we can't just dismiss that resentment that's being held. So for me, it's interesting. There's a guy, you know, Morgan McSweeney, who you know, did work for the Prime Minister. You know, I remember having a conversation with him, and you know, he had a very rational conversation with me about the challenges that we faced. But what he said to me was, we need to move to a position where everything that we do as a government is linked to dealing with the cost of living crisis. And I think that, you know, from a political perspective, that's vital. But we can't, until we alleviate that, people are going to continue to resent.
Yeah, I think, from what you're both saying, there's a balance, isn't there? Because you said we can talk ourselves into recession, we can talk ourselves into fear, but we have to acknowledge how people really are and are really feeling, don't we? Because it's happening on steroids in America, isn't it? And they're just, you know, Trump's spending all his money on his ballroom and the cost of living's going up, and his government is saying it's not going up. He's just, you know, and he's losing support because people feel it and people need to be heard. Like you've both been saying, people need to be heard. Another question, please.
Powerful talk, is that on? Yes. Okay. So my question is for you, Marcus. So you mentioned meeting people where they are in the context of their fear, and I wondered if you could just unpack that a little bit, please.
I think the point I made about how it's easy sometimes when we see people, you know, voting for political parties that we disagree with, we think for stupid reasons, to criticise, to argue that there's somehow that person is deficient in some way. And I see colleagues do it all the time. You know, and when I mean colleagues, people across the left spectrum, I see doing it all the time. I think that's wrong. I genuinely think it's wrong. I think you've got to be comfortable speaking to people who at times you may think are racist. Because all that's different now than what we had a few years ago is that people are more open about talking about it publicly. Because they're now seeing people on platforms saying things that a decade ago were considered to be, you know, worthy of cancelling. They're now seeing politicians say stuff, and it's emboldening those attitudes. And if we don't meet those people and talk exactly what they're talking about without casting moral aspersions upon them, they're never going to listen to us. They're never going to join together collectively with us. And then they're going to pursue politically politicians who want to divide. And in that regard, I'm saying we can be dividers as well. We can divide ourselves from the people that we think are wrong, or we can try and wrap our arms around them as well.
Anyone else? Yes, lady at the front.
Thank you. Following on from that, how can we?
Just go a little bit closer.
How can we listen to people who we disagree with without leaving them believing that we agree with them?
I really like that. That's really interesting. Have you got a technique, Marcus?
I'm quite the diplomat, I can tell you. Look, I did an exercise during the election where, I'm a big believer in knocking on doors. I believe that you have to meet as many of your voters as you can. And I spent weeks and weeks and weeks of my life, and have done over the last 2 decades, knocking on doors, trying to get people elected. But in the election I stood in 2024, I spent a bit more time on the doorstep speaking to people, much to the annoyance of my agent who wanted me to get a move on. And I had this theory, which was that people don't tell us the truth. They see a Labour politician on the doorstep and they want to talk to a Labour politician about the things that Labour politicians talk about, the NHS, schools, that malarkey. But I knew that the polls were telling me that people were really concerned about immigration. So I had a bit of patter on the doorstep that I would start with, where I would say, oh, we've been out today, I've met a load of people, we've talked about the local school, we've had a chat about the hospital, also had a bit of a chat about immigration. And once they knew that I was open to talk about it, they opened up. And the statistic that I had at the end of it, because we run back to the board and we make notes, was that 9 out of 10 people that I mentioned small boats or immigration to expressed concern on that issue. The thing was, it didn't matter if they were a Conservative voter, a Labour voter, a Lib Dem voter, a Green voter, you name it, everybody was concerned. Some of them expressed views which I would say were racist. Yep. I met a guy from London living in Penrith. He likes me very much after that. He once saw me in the street and shook my hand and told me what a nice guy I was. Racist, right? Big, big racist. And unashamedly. But, look, it allowed me to hear just by asking that question and letting them know I was open to listening, it allowed me to hear a much wider perspective. And so, I'm not surprised at what happened yesterday, because I know that it's been bubbling under the surface. And so it's about us engaging in those conversations, because if we don't talk, we can't counter those narratives. We can't find out the source of those narratives, find out where that information is coming from. And so I'm just a big believer in us all having difficult conversations. And that doesn't mean that we're saying, we agree with them, but it's saying we believe that we have to talk and we have to listen to each other.
Doing a lot of, I'm running quite a lot of sessions about difficult conversations and navigating difference and listening at the moment in different parts of my life. I seem to be suddenly doing it because I think it's really, really important. And I think we can accept that we are all different. I don't think we have to say we agree with people to listen to them. And we can express curiosity. I think that's a key thing, is to express curiosity. So someone says something that you don't agree with, you go, oh, well, I'm curious about that, because I don't feel that, or I don't see that, but I'm curious. So you're not dismissing someone. So there are techniques, I think. And if we are people of love, and we go out and treat people as equals, of equal value to ourselves, which we do as Christians, that should be obvious in the way we speak and listen to them, I think. Is that not dismissing, not making assumptions, not putting other people in a box. It's not natural. We all like to be in little clans to some extent, but I think it's something we can do. And I think it's something that people of faith can do uniquely, because it's, we are called to do it, really, and we know that we should, don't we? And we believe in the intrinsic value of the people we're talking to, don't we, and listening to. Sorry, Marcus, you wanted to come back.
Can I add? Some of you will remember Charles Clarke, former Home Secretary, who's now in the House of Lords. He's got a son, I think he might be called Chris, who wrote a book called The Dark Knight and the Puppet Master. And he talks about populism, but he talks about left-wing populism as is his main analysis. And what he describes is this view that some people have, who are people who are politically engaged, that there's this spectrum. You've got the right wing and you've got the left wing, and you've got various people who sit somewhere along that line, and people like to debate about where different people sit. And I've spent my life trying to work out where I sit, and I can't work it out myself. But people believe there is this continuum. But some people view that continuum as a moral continuum, where one end you're evil, and the other end you're one of the good guys. And some people believe it's either one way or the other. And what Chris Clark in his book attempts to do is to say the left and right thing isn't about our morals and our ethics. It's not about what we want. It's about how we achieve it. So why do we end up calling people evil? Because they just don't believe that we get to where we need to be in a different, they believe that we get there in a different way. And I think there's something in that argument that we recognise that many of us want the same thing. We want a safe world where our families can live and have enough money in their pockets, and we want access to good services and good healthcare and a good cultural life. And I think when you express things in those terms, we can all agree with it. And that's when you realise, I think that's where you truly realise that the how we get there is almost the irrelevance. Why are we judging each other on tactics and strategy when ultimately we believe in the same outcomes?
We got another. Oh, sorry, Nick. Did you want to come into that?
I was just going to. I really like that question, because most people ask, how do we talk to people who disagree with us? But you've asked, how do we talk to people who disagree with us without kidding them into believing that we are agreeing with them, right? And I like the question because it chases me around so much. Because spun positively, I'm a very relational person. Spun negatively, I need to be liked. I kind of get into these conversations, and I'm hesitant to push back against somebody for fear that in doing so, the relationship will break down. But then I come away thinking, they come away with the illusion that I agree with them, and actually I objected to. It seems to me, and this is from somebody who's not very good at it, that the challenge, actually picking up what Marcus said there, is as it were, to simultaneously be able to agree and disagree. Because if you're just agreeing with somebody, there's almost no point, because they think, the shutters have come down, we share nothing in common. Whereas if you have done enough to build some kind of common interest, where they think, at least on those issues, you're on the same side, then it becomes a bit easier to say, but I don't agree with you about this because X, Y, and Z. So in a sense, those forms of disagreement become just a bit easier when you've already built some kind of common relationship there from which to have them.
Yeah, probably not just in that conversation. No. You've established a relationship, and then, yeah. Another question? Bill, William.
So I've written this as a question with a question word at the start and a question mark at the end, but it's not really a question, and I did want to say it while Marcus is in the room. How grateful should we be for people who are willing to stand in the public sphere, take all this flack, and reflect seriously as Christians?
Do you want a response?
Well, I mentioned before that I have colleagues who have had a real hard time. Women MPs who get rape threats regularly. A male MP of mine whose next door neighbour's son wants to kill him and expresses it on social media on a regular basis. And these are difficult times. What I would say, and I think we should respect and try and build safe places for people to engage in that regard. One thing that upsets me is that when I was a little boy, I used to go to my dad's MP surgeries. I used to sit with him on a regular basis. I've been exposed to kind of stories about what was going on in the steelworks in Workington and loads of issues over many, many years because I got those experiences.